All right, we'll call the meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this extraordinary meeting of the Transport and Infrastructure Committee, which is here today with the sole purpose of addressing Auckland Council's submission in response to the draft government policy statement on land transport. Before we get into the item proper, we have a few formalities as per usual. There are a number of members online, and I will note those members now, and if there's anyone else we can add to that. So I have Councillors Ferry, Leone, Sayers, and I'm looking up and seeing Councillor Dalton and Councillor Foley and Councillor Foley. So I think anyone else out there in the ether? No? Okay, so we've noted those members online. We come to the first item as apologies. We have received apologies, which is on the screen, from Deputy Mayor Simpson on council business, Councillor Filipaina. We have apologies for lateness from Councillor Walker, who was walking the talk and catching the Gulf Harbour ferry, so he runs a little tight on schedule, but he will be here. Are there any more apologies that we have? No?
Happy to move.
Okay, moved by Councillor Fletcher, seconded by Councillor Turner. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Come on to item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations? No. Item 3, welcome Mr Mayor. Petitions, no petitions in this section, which brings us to item 4, which is public input, and we have received one request, which was received and accepted, and to that end we have a delegation from all aboard the Transport Decarbonisation Trust, who wish to speak to Auckland Council's submission in response to the draft government policy statement, and who were able to actually get a copy of that submission late last evening. So we appreciate the effort that's gone in from that delegation, who will come to the front table now. And as they're coming up, I'd welcome Paul, Jessica and Magali, who will be addressing us today regarding the submission that we will be considering in just a minute. So the team have been told that they have 5 minutes to present to us, after which there will be no doubt a couple of questions. If you see the little microphone button, you're okay with that, so just press the right one and the red marker comes up. Okay, welcome, and over to you, Magali.
Thank you so much. Kia ora, team. So my name is Magali Menard. I'm the Executive Director for All Aboard Transport Decarbonisation Trust. Joining me today is Jessica Palleray, the Executive Director of Lawyers for Climate Action, and Paul Whitten, the Chair of the Board of Trustees for All Aboard. We'd like to start by thanking you so much for accepting our request to join the conversation, and specifically for all of your hard work on this submission on the GPS. We were very pleased with most of the recommendations that were put forward. So following our review, we'd like to emphasize the need for Auckland Council to retain their ability to take concrete action on largely decarbonising the transport system by 2030.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As Magali said, my name is Jessica and I'm the Executive Director at Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand. And in the couple of minutes which I have today, I wanted to zoom out and contextualise the GPS within New Zealand's wider climate obligations, talking here about legal obligations, domestic and international, as we are concerned that the draft GPS takes us well off track to meeting our climate targets and commitments, and that could result in legal problems for the government moving forward. We know that transport policy is one of the key levers that we have for meeting our climate commitments. That's very, very clear. The Climate Change Commission has made that clear, and we understand the Council accepts that as well. And we agree with the Council's concern that the sole reliance on the ETS to reduce emissions is worrying, and apparently the government's lack of interest in tackling the decarbonisation of transport. We're very concerned by that, as transport can't and shouldn't be taken out of the picture. The climate commitments and legal obligations that we're talking about here, which we think the government has not recognised in the GPS and which could be made stronger in the Council's submission. We're talking here about our emissions budgets, which we know the National Party has agreed to. We're talking about our 2030 NDC, which we are not on track currently to meet, which is a international legal obligation which the government has a good faith and due diligence obligation to meet. And we're talking about our overarching goal to reach net zero by 2050 and to hit a 1.5 degree target per the Paris Agreement. The draft GPS makes no mention of any of these commitments, and we are concerned that, if passed, it will demonstrate a lack of good faith by the government when concerning our legal commitments, but also it's very difficult to see how we're going to meet our emissions budget, and we're concerned by that. This context is critical, and we support the Council's concerns about the lack of climate as a priority within the draft GPS. Thank you.
So just to add on, the draft GPS risks embarrassing Aotearoa internationally due to its departure from climate and safe system planning. The significant shift of investment away from the already underfunded safe and sustainable travel to roading exacerbates the roots of climate crisis and negatively impacts the productivity and economy of Auckland. The reputation risks created to the country extends by default to each city and region forced to follow the policy.
So I'll briefly comment on the draft GPS and then I'll make some suggestions that might be made to the submission, an excellent submission. So the draft GPS, as it stands, is a great document if the objective is to strangle a city with cost, congestion and carbon. On cost and congestion, paragraph 180 in your submission nails the absurdity of the draft GPS, which permits investment only when demonstrated volumes of pedestrians and cyclists already exist. My 11-year-old daughter caught an AT bus to school today and my 9-year-old walked 2 kilometres to school today. That took one car off the road at peak time, gave me back the better part of an hour to come and talk to you, and gave my girls a sense of independence and the health benefits of a stroll. Had that not been in place, there not been a relatively safe walking path and a cost-effective, timely bus service, I'd be losing a day a week to being a taxi. These productivity issues are real. But living in central Auckland, I'm one of the lucky ones who can actually do that. We need to make this available to everybody in this city. On carbon, the draft GPS says that the ETS will do all of the work. To achieve Auckland's goals would require a carbon cost that would add about $1 a litre to petrol. That would smash travel very quickly by car, but without alternative modes, as the draft GPS sets us up for, we simply strangle the freedom to move around Auckland and cost Aucklanders almost $1 billion more every year. Lastly, the draft GPS reaches into local government decision-making, will make innovation using existing infrastructure hard, what we need to be doing more of, and is entirely incompatible with the wishes of Aucklanders. So, our recommendations on your already excellent draft submission, 3 things. More strongly reject the proposed restriction on walking, cycling and public transport investment. Auckland cannot deliver its plan with these shackles. Secondly, call for health to be more explicitly prioritised. We know that upwards of 3,000 people are already dying every year because of transport pollution, and that comes at massive social and economic cost. And lastly, the GPS should explicitly prioritise for carbon emissions reduction. Fixing this fixes everything at the lowest cost to council capex OPEX and the lowest cost to the pockets of the citizens of New Zealand and Auckland. And that can be done by delivering on the TERP that has already been committed by the people in this room. So in short, the GPS should be rejected and rewritten to reflect the needs of Aucklanders and the needs of New Zealanders. Thank you.
All right, right on 5. Well done, folks, and a lot compressed into that presentation there. So we'll take a couple of questions, and Councillor Hills.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Surprised you got here after seeing it so late last night. The question I have is the economic impacts of some of the GPS, if we have those public transport cuts, and also what does leaning into the ETS do to the pockets of Aucklanders? So what, if we truly are to use the ETS without any fallback or funding in climate activities, what will that tangibly do to a family or a person in the next few years?
Sure. So shall I comment on that? So it is in principle possible to use the ETS solely as the vehicle for decarbonisation of transport, of everything. The best current estimate from recent research on this is that it would add between 70 cents and $1 per litre of petrol. If we work through the maths on that, that will cost Aucklanders on the order of $1 billion a year out of, and this is just light vehicle, this is not freight, so it's more if we start to add freight into that, about $1 billion extra per year. Unfortunately, because there are no meaningful alternatives at the scale that is needed, cycling, walking, and buses, and that the cost of those is proposed to go up because of the comments around fare box capture, it is likely that there would be even more costs to consumers than that, and that it would massively constrain Aucklanders' ability to move around our city.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, and finally, Councillor Henderson, and then we'll finish with Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Chair. Fantastic presentation, and a reminder that I've got to re-up my subs for the Lawyers for Climate Action. Just in terms of legal risk, because I think it is something we do need to take into account. Lawyers have been on the front lines in climate action across the world. Just want to assess, is there a legal risk for the government's draft GPS, and have there been cases brought overseas against governments for lack of climate action?
Yes and yes. So climate litigation internationally is a really effective way of holding decision makers to account. And we're also seeing that in New Zealand. It's not just an international phenomena. We're bringing cases against the government already in terms of lack of ambition and lack of compliance with our overarching legal frameworks. So yes, that is a risk. And yes, the government should be thinking quite carefully about the steps it takes because it needs to comply with its obligations. The window of opportunity is rapidly closing, and we are closely assessing what the government is doing.
Thank you.
Finally, Councillor Turner.
Thank you. Just two questions. First one, do you see the hypocrisy I see between what we say we want to achieve and 4 vehicles following one man around to pick up rubbish, trucks trucking dirt to the other side of the city to put it into a fill, trucking aggregate all the way from halfway down to Taupo back to the city? Those sorts of considerations also have an effect on carbon. Do you see that?
We're stuck in a system that obliges us to behave in certain manners at the moment. We're stuck in that system because the decision makers have not yet allowed us to move as quickly as is needed to change to a more sustainable future. Auckland Council is in front of everybody in this country and actually taking action that will lead to the future that our kids need. So it is true that we are in living hypocrisy at the moment to some extent. It is also true that we are locked in that hypocrisy. You need to embrace that and support people like you to make the right decisions so that we can shift away from those excessive consumption patterns.
Thank you. Second question, what should we do to unlock that hypocrisy?
You walked straight into that one. We should deliver on the TERP. In Auckland, we have an excellent and world-leading plan that will deliver the lowest cost, best outcomes for the citizens of the city. It serves as a poster child for not only other urban environments in New Zealand, but also other places around the world. We know that the Mayor and the Council has signed up to the C40 City again, and that has been noticed. People live in cities that they want to, that they can move around easy, and people are making decisions on the basis of their ability to move comfortably around a city. Auckland, under the proposed GPS, would be going in the wrong direction. If we can just deliver on the TERP, and we've had a couple of wrinkles in that, then we will get there.
Right, thank you. There's a recommendation up there to receive the input from all aboard regarding Auckland Council's submission on the GPS, and thank you for attending, and particularly thank you for your own analysis of that document so late in the piece. So I think we moved by Councillor Henderson and seconded by Councillor Fletcher. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much again. Next item up is local board input, and there is no local board, but as I understand it, Robert will be addressing in his presentation some of the local board submissions. Item number 6, there's no extraordinary business, which brings us to the item proper, the Auckland Council submission. So I will welcome to the table the team. Robert Simpson, Manager of Transport and Strategy, and I think Hamish Bunn from Auckland Transport and Mark Lang from Auckland Transport, and I welcome Richard and Dean, who are also in attendance from Auckland Transport. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for your attendance here today. Barry, do you want to say something now or after I finish? Maybe after we've finished. Okay, so just before I hand over to Robert, I will make an apology to the public and indeed to the councillors about the rather rushed nature of proceedings here, but that has been imposed on us by the rather constrained nature of the timeline, and that is certainly noted, I think, in the commentary and the submission on the process.
Mr. Chairman, can I just make this is impossible. This is a massive amount of material with a whole lot of things that have got to be researched and looked back on, because I think there's numbers that are wrong in here, and to get this at 8:37 on the morning of a meeting like this is just hopeless.
Well, if I could just finish, Councillor Williamson, what I was saying is that is indeed the very point that we make in our submission when we talk about the process, and we make the point that Auckland Council is disappointed with the short time frame provided for consultation on the draft GPS. And that has unfortunately been a feature of successive governments now, but that's the position we're in, and I certainly thank the team who have laboured to do as well as they can under those very tight circumstances. So welcome, and over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora, everyone. I understand before I start the presentation that that the correct procedure is for me to speak to the 2 items that have been tabled, one of which is a letter from the Chair of the Waiheke Local Board on behalf of the chairs of all the local boards. The topic for that letter is around traffic management costs, and particularly in relation to special events. We haven't had a chance to consider that in detail, but I will note that the GPS does talk, without necessarily going into any detail, on the need to reduce the costs for traffic management, and the council and our draft submission have supported the government in that particular issue. The second tabled item is the feedback received from all 21 local boards. That's a great response from local boards. Again, we've only had a chance to skim read that, and it appears on the basis of that skim read that they are very largely in favour of almost all the points many of the points that we make in the submission, particularly around the impacts of likely cuts to public transport, walking and cycling funding. So the views of all the local boards will be appended to our submission as a standard practice, and sent to the Ministry of Transport along with the submission as a whole. So on to the presentation itself, and I will try to fly through this as quickly as possible to leave you time for discussion and debate. First of all, how did we get where we are now? The draft GPS was released on the 4th of March, and since then we've had a number of interactions with you, including a very detailed memo that we sent out on the 11th of March summarising the submission and some potential implications for Auckland. We followed that up with a workshop last week, sent the draft submission out 2 days later on the Friday to you to receive feedback, and have received that feedback and attempted to incorporate that as best we can into the latest draft, which is before you for your consideration today. The deadline from the government for submissions is Tuesday, midday, 2nd of April. Very quick recap here. All GPSs set out the government of the day's strategic priorities for the land transport system. This GPS has 4 such priorities, with most emphasis on economic growth and productivity. You can see the 4 of them there. I won't go into them. We in the submission have supported these 4 strategic priorities, whilst also expressing concern at the omission of certain other items, which I'll get to. That support was caveated a bit in respect of safety and economic growth and productivity, which I'll get to in a moment as well. So, as I say, we sent the draft to you on Friday, received feedback from a number of councillors, which we have attempted to incorporate as best we possibly could. In the submission, you can see some of the changes there. They're highlighted in yellow on the draft that you've got for consideration today, the changes made since the version we sent to you on Friday. I mentioned the local board views that we've received. So, key themes for our submission. You can see them there. I won't go through them because we have slides on most of these coming up. What I will say is that these themes have been thoroughly worked through as far as time constraints allowed between Auckland Transport and ourselves, and there's very good alignment at the staff level, and also very good alignment at the AT board level as well. And Chair Leggett is here today, and I'm sure he'd be happy to speak to you if required to elaborate on the board's views. So we've split the presentation into 2 sections from here on in. One is highlighting some of the strategic issues emerging from the draft GPS, and then we'll move on to some of the more detailed funding related issues. Chief amongst the strategic issues is the omission of any reference to the uniqueness of Auckland, the special needs of Auckland, and most importantly, lack of any commitment in the GPS to agreeing an integrated transport plan with the council. This is a departure from the norm for previous GPSs, dating back to 2015, where there's always been some kind of commitment from government to working with council on transport-related matters. There's no such commitment in this document. We think, as we've discussed with you previously, that the integrated transport plan is the appropriate place to address some of the issues raised in the GPS and in our submission. Likewise, we also think it's the appropriate place to agree what the key priorities are for major projects in years to come. We also raise a point in relation to the framing of economic growth and productivity in the GPS, and there are elements in that, as I say, that we support. There are also elements that we have questions about, and in particular the lack of recognition for the fact that enhancing economic growth and productivity in a built-up urban environment such as Auckland requires the use of different levers than in less urbanised areas. In particular, Auckland is obviously growing rapidly, 47,000 people, I understand, over the last 12 months. Our transport challenges are more acute, particularly in terms of congestion, but other challenges as well, transport affordability being one. Land, obviously, is limited and it's expensive, and especially in areas where the transport need is greatest. So the focus needs to be on getting more out of our existing network, and that is certainly the theme that we've heard from you over the last year or two in terms of our transport planning. What does that mean? It means that we have to emphasise more space-efficient ways for people and goods to get around. So that means an emphasis on demand management tools, such as time of use charging, of course, but also, and very importantly, mode shift. And we're concerned, and this is a theme that runs throughout the draft submission, we're concerned that parts of the GPS take a particularly prescriptive approach that will potentially constrain Auckland's ability to tailor solutions to its own needs. Freight is another key focus for the GPS. The submission expresses support for that focus and for the need to move freight more efficiently. We are concerned, however, there's very little emphasis on moving the need to move freight to rail, and the submission expresses that. And that's particularly important for Auckland, given the decongestion benefits arising from moving freight to rail, not to mention, of course, the emissions benefits. You've heard a presentation this morning already on climate environmental issues. We share many of the concerns that you've heard this morning. There is a short statement in the front of the GPS talking about the emphasis that will be placed on the emissions trading scheme as the primary means of addressing climate concerns. You've heard some numbers around the likely impact that will have on petrol prices. That will have significant equity impacts for Aucklanders, will have significant impacts on household budgets, particularly lower income households, unless we are able to provide much better alternatives for people to get around. And the GPS doesn't necessarily support that. That is the only mention of climate or environmental issues in the GPS, and this goes against, this runs counter to existing council policy. Another key omission that we see from the GPS in terms of strategic priorities is around working with Māori. Both the government and ourselves as Auckland Council have treaty obligations in this regard. And I think it goes beyond that, of course. My personal experience working on a whole range of transport planning exercises is that when we engage properly with Māori, we end up with a richer, higher quality outcome. There's no mention of that in this GPS, and we think there should be. The GPS sets out a number of potential reforms for the transport planning, funding and governance system. These are all at quite a high level. There's not a huge amount of detail in respect of any of them. Nevertheless, at an in-principle level, we think we should be supporting these. They align very well with where Council is getting to. Just draw your attention to a couple of them, of course. Reducing the complexity of NZTA business case approval processes. Our colleagues at Auckland Transport spend a lot of money every year trying to meet the requirements of Whakakatahi in this regard, and any efforts to reduce that administrative burden and get things going quicker, I'm sure would be welcomed by many. The GPS also proposes a review, an overhaul of the way in which we fund transport, the way in which we gather revenue, I should say, for transport in this country, including looking at time of use charging. Again, something that we would support and I think we would seek to be involved in as well. I already talked about the focus on reducing traffic management costs, which is another area that we'd welcome. Multimodal funding. So there's a clear theme throughout the GPS to move away from the increased flexibility of more recent GPSs, which have enabled multimodal projects that attempt to improve outcomes for all users on a single corridor, whether they be people in cars, people on bikes or pedestrians. There's a theme in the GPS to move away from funding those projects as a whole and to instead break them into their constituent parts, and those parts have to be funded from different activity classes. There's no detail around how this will be implemented, but it is likely to increase the administrative burden for Auckland Transport in terms of submission of applications for funding. It's also potentially likely to lead to delay with project delivery, given that there'll be different levels of constraint and different activity classes. So some parts of a project might receive funding, other parts may not. What do? Do we wait? Do we delay the whole project? Do we deliver part of the project and then come back a year or two later? There's no clarity around any of these kind of things. And our recommendation, first of all, our plan A is to seek a return to the greater flexibility that we've seen of recent years, dating back to at least 2015. And plan B, the fallback option being that we ask Whakakatahi NZTA to do their best to reduce the administration costs associated with this new approach. Particularly a problem for renewals, where the contractual arrangement for renewals, where really there's no particular difference between renewing the part of the road corridor dedicated to general traffic versus the part of the road corridor that's painted for buses or painted for cyclists. So there will be additional contractual complexity introduced, we think, as a result of these changes. Also, walking and cycling is particularly hit in this regard, we think. So, for example, when delivering a new project, a new road, the footpath, the funding for the footpath associated with that road would need to come from a different funding activity. Potential there for delay, potential that we may not even be able to deliver that footpath. Again, these are questions we don't have answers for at the moment, but we would be seeking clarity on them. Likewise, a number of already consented projects contain multimodal elements. If, for example, we look at the East-West Link, which is one of the government's roads of national significance, its current consenting conditions require the provision of walking and cycling infrastructure. Taken literally, under the approach set out in this GPS, funding would have to be sought from different categories to deliver that project. And in the case of the walking and cycling budget, that is likely to be under extreme pressure. And so delivering the walking and cycling elements of East-West Link would likely either make a severe dent in that activity class or simply couldn't be funded from that activity class. Right, so that's some of the more strategic issues, and now moving on to some of the more detailed funding implications. At an overall level, there's a nominal increase in funding available through the NLTF in this GPS compared to the 2021 version, 15% increase up to 20.2 billion. However, unfortunately, since 2021, there's also been a cost escalation in the order of 15 to 20% for most of the things that AT does, which obviously eats significantly into that increase in overall funding. Of course, there are unknowns here. We don't know exactly how much of the overall national funding Auckland will receive, and that will vary across activity classes, nor do we know where the final funding availability will sit within the band for each of the activity classes. So there are a number of variables there. That said, preliminary analysis from Auckland Transport suggests there will likely to be very significant shortfalls in co-funding availability from NZTA to support the LTP program, particularly in respect of public transport services, public transport infrastructure, walking and cycling, and local road improvements. Let's move on to public transport services, which is an area of key concern for both Council and Auckland Transport. There will be very significant pressure on this activity class. The overall funding levels are reduced by 10% compared to the previous GPS, and that's despite the increase in operating costs that I mentioned earlier. AT is planning to submit a bid for a signal to Waka Kotahi. I understand that it will be bidding for approximately $1 billion to support existing services over the next 3 years, and additional allocation also for new services. As I say, there is uncertainty, as there always is at this stage of the process, around how much Auckland will get and how much will be available in each activity class. But let's say that if AT received 40% of national funding in this activity class, and you can see the significant shortfalls we would be facing, depending on whether the funding came in overall at the lower or upper end of the band. Addressing these kind of increases alone would solely through increases in fares would require a very significant increase, as you can see the numbers there, depending on whether the funding came in at the upper or lower end of the band. These numbers are obviously all indicative. It's too early to give any kind of certainty, but it gives you a feel for the kind of cuts that we're facing here. What this means in practice is significant cuts to existing services, inability to deliver new services. That's particularly a problem when we think about all the money that has been invested by both government and council in critical projects like the CRL and the Eastern Busway, and we may find ourselves in a position where we would find it very difficult to provide the services needed to get the most out of that investment in infrastructure. So it's absolutely critical to Auckland's transport system as a whole, not just public transport, but to the way in which Auckland is able to get around the city and their ability to do so. It's absolutely critical that this be addressed. Public transport infrastructure. There is a proposed decrease in this activity class again. Much of the funding in year one, for Auckland at least, is already spoken for in terms of CRL and Eastern Busway. And you can see some of the numbers there around our existing commitments, and depending on whether funding came in at the lower or upper end of the range, how much we would need of that in Auckland to deliver on existing commitments. The government does specify two public transport projects, major public transport projects for Auckland, as being a key priority for that, and I'm sure many would welcome that, including that's the Northwest RTN and Airport to Botany. However, if these projects were to be funded out of the public transport infrastructure class, it would probably consume all of it. So our recommendation through the submission is that these projects be funded from elsewhere, and that they be treated in similar fashion to the RONs, and that they are nationally significant projects. And the funding distribution between council and Auckland Transport council and the government should reflect that. Roads and maintenance, there have been significant increases here. We welcome the increase in funding for maintenance. Auckland Transport is planning a significant increase in its ability to renew the network, and this funding will help support that, although the analysis is still to be done as to what extent that is true. There's significant increases in the state highway improvements category. Nevertheless, despite that increase, the analysis would still need to be done, but it's unlikely that all 15 of the government's RONs would be able to be funded out of this activity class, despite that more than doubling in funding availability. The GPS is very explicit. This goes to the multimodal point I made before. The GPS is very explicit that walking and cycling cannot be funded out of road improvement projects, even where walking and cycling infrastructure is delivered alongside a road improvement. So, as I say, we certainly in the submission welcome the increase in maintenance funding, but there is a risk of unintended consequences, and I alluded to that earlier in the discussion on the multimodal rules. Safety, there has been a significant change of emphasis here. So the safety activity class is now to be used for policing, enforcement, education. We certainly welcome an increased emphasis on those matters. The funding for infrastructure improvements is now to come out of the road improvement categories, both state highway and local, which explains the 40% decrease in the safety activity class overall compared to the previous road to zero class. We are concerned, while we welcome the government's emphasis or increased focus on those matters, enforcement and education, we are concerned that this moves away from the focus on a safe system approach, which has characterised each GPS dating back to 2012. This is the approach that recognises that drivers will make mistakes, and that we should be designing our system to accommodate that in terms of our infrastructure improvements in order to mitigate those the impacts of those mistakes. There's no mention in the safety class on walking and cycling safety improvements. They're to be funded out of the walking and cycling activity class. There's also, in general terms, it takes a more prescriptive approach to what can and what can't be funded. So we welcome elements of the government's focus on safety, but we also question other parts of it. The rail network, significant changes here again. The government has restated its commitment to funding the current round of infrastructure upgrades or maintenance that KiwiRail is undertaking on the network. Obviously, we welcome that. However, from about year 3 onwards, there's a massive drop in the lower end of the funding range for rail infrastructure, and that raises all sorts of questions around our ability, or KiwiRail's ability, to fund necessary maintenance on the network here on in. The emphasis in this activity class is very much on certain parts of the country, Auckland included, but there's very little emphasis on freight, as I mentioned before. Walking and cycling, there is a nominal funding increase in this activity class, but again, this activity class has been asked to do a lot more than has previously been the case in terms of funding the maintenance for walking and cycling, and basically any investment to do with walking and cycling has to come from this class, as I mentioned before. It's likely that even if funding does come in at the top end, it will be significantly oversubscribed from existing projects around the country, which leaves very little scope for new investments. I've mentioned multimodal. In summary, the changes flagged in the GPS will likely have a very significant impact on AT's ability to continue to deliver its active modes program. The GPS signals government's priority for delivering a number of key projects, some roads of national significance, 3 in Auckland, 4 if you include the Walkwith to Wellsford, and some major public transport projects as well, completing 2 and building 2 others. Our approach in the submission has been to avoid relitigating these projects, in line with our view that the integrated transport plan is the appropriate place where council and government can agree between them what the major projects should be. And that's it from me, Mr. Chair, and welcome any questions you have. We have a number of colleagues behind us who are in between us. We hope to be able to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thanks, Robert. And of course, this was a collaborative effort with Auckland Transport, and the submission has the support of the Auckland Transport officers and their board. Is there anything, Hamish and Mark, you'd like to add at this point, or just there to answer any questions that members might have?
No, we're just here for questions, thank you.
Okay, great. So just before I go over to questions, just a quick reminder of the process here. You know, despite the rather truncated timeline, we have made every effort to inform people along the way. We had the memo in March. There was a workshop last week that covered the GPS, and on Friday the draft submission was sent out, and councillors and whole quarter members were invited to give feedback, which a number of people did. Thank you, and that feedback has been incorporated in this submission. So despite the pressure of time, we certainly have endeavoured to enable people to feedback into that process along the way up to date and informing the submission that's before us here today. So having said that, if there are questions that people have got on the presentation, which was received at the workshop, of course we'll welcome them now. Councillor Walker.
Sure. Given that this GPS is 10 years, and given that we know that there's a significant increase in rail operational costs when the CRL kicks in, are you factoring that into your submission, and are we covering off the numbers around that?
It's a great question. So again, while they've referenced 10 years, this is still only allocating money for the next 3, which is one of those key issues with the central government funding model. We have factored into, and sorry, maybe I'll frame it a different way. We've obviously created an LTP that's out for consultation. The numbers we're looking at in relation to this line up with the LTP, the first 3 years of it, and we're then stress testing those numbers and the assumed co-funding against what's potentially sitting in the GPS. And what this is clearly showing up is that in the first 3 years, there's a massive risk around the funding of public transport, just to keep what we've currently got on the road, before you start funding Eastern Busway and CRL services. So you can think of it in other ways. We don't think there's enough money in there to match what council set aside in the LTP.
Coming back to my question, have we got anything in our submission around the impact of the increased funding associated with the CRL? That's in this submission, because this is a 10-year statement. And quite obviously, you know, we know it kicks in. When does the operational cost of the CRL kick in?
In year 3, essentially, in these numbers.
Is within the next 3 years, and certainly within the next 10.
Yes, so to answer the question directly, yes, we do capture that. We are saying that services. We're facing the increased costs associated with CRL in particular, and that depending on where the funding lands in the band, there will be risks to the increased services we're planning for City Rail Link.
To further question, do we break out the costs of the additional funding for the CRL? I haven't read through everything in detail, but do we break it out so it's highlighted?
No, we don't. We wouldn't see that as being necessary as part of this. We've signalled what we need, and it's in that figure there. Over the next 3 years, the AT requires NZTA for PT services, 985 million. That's what our request is to maintain existing services, and that is broken down at paragraph 137 in the submission. But we haven't gone further into that. NZTA are aware of the details. We don't think it's necessary.
Councillor Fletcher.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it is, and I'll certainly raise that when I speak to this later.
Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you. Robert, can you remind us, please, where this fits within the legislation generally around transport?
Yes, so the government is obliged to produce a GPS every 3 years, and under the clauses in the Land Transport Management Act, local authorities, and in our case Auckland Transport, are required to give are required for their RLTPs to be consistent with the GPS.
Thank you for that. And I don't intend this to sound in any way patsy, but how difficult has it been to pull together such a comprehensive response within the time frame?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Fletcher. It has been very challenging. It has involved a great many late nights and early mornings, up to and well beyond midnight, for a number of people in our team and from Auckland Transport. But I will say that people have stepped up to the task, and that there's been excellent collaboration with staff at AT, who have provided us with all the details that we needed to fill out the submission.
So to that end, given that this is being presented to us as a package, how difficult would it be if people start picking it apart now and treating it like a smorgasbord?
It would certainly create a whole new set of challenges. There are themes to the submission, and if we start picking apart elements of it, then that may undermine some of those themes, particularly around, as we say, the need for a focus on Auckland and some of the other strategic issues we've got in there, climate and so on. So yes, it would provide a whole new set of challenges, and there's very little time to make those changes. That said, of course, members are, if members instruct us to make changes, that is absolutely what we'll do.
Thank you. And given the focus and the weighting that we've put on the integrated transport plan and the Auckland, the lack of focus on Auckland, my understanding is that the ITP will come to the next Transport and Infrastructure Committee. Can you confirm that you're working towards that, and that members will have the opportunity on the 4th of April to start giving deeper consideration into the integrated transport plan?
That is correct. I just will clarify that a little bit, though. It's not the integrated transport plan itself that we're bringing next week. It's the preliminary work that this committee authorised us to do around us as a council developing a position in advance of our discussions with government on agreeing the ITP. So yes, we will have an update for you in April, and an additional update in May as well.
I think that's really important, Chair, because it helps us with consistency and alignment as we work our way progressively through this, and I want to thank you for the work.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. We have councillors Darby, Baker and Henderson.
Thanks to you all, and I also note the concerted effort that's been put into this, and there are no divergent views between Auckland Transport and Auckland Council. Most interesting. Can I just look at the safety first? Auckland Transport uses a figure of deaths and serious injuries avoided due to the implementation of aspects of the safety program. And some of those include mid-block crossings and other things that have been implemented over recent years, and there was a plan to continue with that. And it was going to save some 13.35 deaths and serious injuries per annum. Now, there's a significant backpedaling on the safety program here. So can we assume that the deaths and serious injuries at 13 a year, at least, because it's more than just the raised platforms program, that deaths and serious injuries avoided number will not be reached? So in effect, more Aucklanders are likely to die and be seriously injured under what is proposed in this GPS.
So I won't speak to the specific targets Auckland Transport may wish to. However, with a move away from a safe system approach, a whole of system type approach, and if as a consequence of that, investment in safety infrastructure is reduced, then it will have negative effects on Aucklanders, and that's likely to show up in DSI statistics.
It's always hard for an officer to say more people will be killed. As a politician, I don't want people to be killed or seriously injured. But the bottom line is, in the direction currently being travelled, more people will be killed and seriously injured. Can you say that?
Well, I mean, there is uncertainty, as I say, around the amount of funding available. Just because the funding has been moved to a different activity class doesn't necessarily mean it won't be available. That said, there are quite directive points in the GPS around what the funding can and can't be used for. Again, if there's a reduction in some of the types of infrastructure that we've provided in the past, then yeah, that may well have an impact on the number of people who die and seriously injured.
Mark, can I go to the PT, the impact on PT infrastructure and services, particularly the services? In the slide and in the submission, we identify a 22% increase in public transport fares would be required if we managed to get the number at the top of the envelope, and then 136% increase in fares if we only got the number at the bottom. What's more realistic is probably something in the middle. It's, from my understanding and the pressure on the whole funding envelope, it is very unlikely that we'll ever see anything at the top. So what is the fare increase if we were to be successful under the current numbers, if we were to take 40% of the middle in that band for PT services? I'm looking at maybe a more realistic number, a percentage increase in fares.
I don't have a specific answer, and clearly it would sit in between, but I guess obviously the key thing I'd call out is fare increases. If you start going above 30-40%, that doesn't take into account elasticity and customer behaviour. If you put through a 100% fare increase, the number of people travelling will drop, and so it will actually exacerbate the issue. So I guess what I would say is AT is committed to looking at, and we understand the intent in there is, can talk about a 40% fare box recovery. We'll undertake a piece of work to go back to saying, well, if we were to try and target 40% fare box, what would need to be true? On the face of it at the moment, fare box recovery is about, when you ignore commercial services and things and discounts come off, it's about 30%. you might need to put through about a 33% fare increase to get to a 40% fare box as of today. I'm not suggesting that's something we want to do, but we're going to do a detailed piece of work, but that by no means actually plugs all of the gap. So you could be staring at, even at the middle of the activity class bands, at a scenario where you have to put through a significant fare increase and cut services. And I know, and sorry if that sounds stark, we've had feedback from Waka Kotahi on their, this packet, the submission, and their view was they thought it was really professional. They were just wondering if we'd elevated some of these issues even highly enough. It is, if you said what's the one thing that concerns me the most in here is our ability to keep running, buses on 1 July.
Okay, and one last one. On the revenue system reform, is it premature in a submission on the GPS to be discussing a greater sort of equity in terms of paying for road maintenance being sort of with the freight industry, which creates incredible damage to the network? Is that going to come in the follow-up body of work, as opposed to getting into the detail of that right now?
Yeah, so as you say, we haven't gone into that level of detail, but there will certainly be opportunities to do so as part of the following up work over in the years to come, months and years to come. Yeah.
Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So just 20.2, I think, billion is the amount that the funding. How much of that is there a debt repayment requirement out of that? So what's the net amount if there is a debt repayment?
I understand it's about 2 billion, so 18 is actually what's available. And again, it's a good question. Our understanding is that it's very, very unlikely that funding will be near the top of the activity class bands. So it's going to put the Waka Kotahi into a very difficult position. So it's not a fully funded GPS, put it that way.
Thanks. In terms of the national ticketing solution, that sits within the public transport activity class. So that has a huge bearing on uplifting, I guess, public transport usage, making it a hell of a lot easier for everyone. Is that within that? And so that, just clarify for me that means that if we committed, it becomes one of the priorities that we have to choose. It sits alongside our PT services. It sits alongside everything. Is that right?
That's correct in terms of what's commercially committed. And again, in that activity class, there's a significant draw on it with Eastern Busway being in flight, the new trains for CRL, the stabling, national ticketing, etc. It leaves very little money in the next 3 years for much else, to be honest. And again, if I give you a practical example, I know for the Mayor, the idea of, like making far better use of our existing network, dynamic lanes, intelligent transport system, etc., those sorts of things are, the potential funding, and therefore some of those is looking quite limited.
And just last one, Chair. So in terms of the rail network, are there any risks to us with I guess you talked about the reduction in year 3. Are there any risks to us, like KiwiRail deciding that they're just going to lump up the track user charges that we have to pay them? Is that a potential risk as they see a drop off in their funding?
Yeah, I believe it would be, yes, because the GPS is quite explicit around, aside from track user charges,
we need next year from Waka Kotahi 300 million for public transport. The bottom end of the band is 400 million nationally. So we need 75% of the national pot. By the time you get to year 3, when you've got more of these services running, we need 83% of the bottom of the band. And that's why, we've got to lobby really hard that this area does get prioritised and they can try and allocate money as high in the band as possible, and then our share of it nationally. But it's that's why it's so stark. But if you start reverse engineering numbers, you get scenarios where you could have to, in theory, take half of our services off the road. So I mean, we hope we don't end up there, and that's why this submission is so important as part of providing feedback on the draft.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chair, Deputy Chair, and staff for allowing Julie and Councillor Ferry and I's request to have this out in public. I think that's important, but also having that submission on Friday night so we could go through it and give feedback was really helpful over the weekend. So thank you. The questions I have, similar to Councillor Henderson, on when would the changes kick in if the GPS stays the same, and when would we have to put up public transport fares, considering on May the 1st we're already doubling under 25s and bringing back charges for kids. What is the impact looking like in July, August?
It is effectively, money gets allocated as a 3-year pot. So we should know from Waka Kotahi in late May how much funding is available for what they call the continuous program, which is, think of that as existing PT services. That will give us time to then consider what we might do. And the point is that money change kicks in from 1 July, so the longer we leave it, it mounts up over the 3-year period. But we should have some certainty in May around the continuous program funding, i.e. existing services.
Okay, thank you. The Eastern Bus, we're adding services all the time when we reach capacity or try and get ahead of it. But with the City Rail Link and the Eastern Busway coming on in this period, there is, what I can see, there would be no money for the services that we would expect from opening those projects. Is that right? There'd be little to no money for what I'm assuming there'd be a big rush to those services, and it doesn't look like the investment would make sense.
Well, there's choices between whether you take other services off the road or ferries or buses to fund CRL services. It's those kind of choices. Okay. I don't know if it's quite that binary.
If we are to, I know that 136% increase is quite an extreme number, obviously lower band if we get 40% of the national fund, but even if it's at the 20s and 30% increases, what have you had a chance to model, probably not, the impact? So the majority of people coming into the city in the mornings are walking, cycling and public transport. What would the congestion look like if, as your modelling shows, 600,000 trips potentially return back to car? What does that do to freight, to people, to congestion?
We haven't done the detailed modelling yet, but obviously in parallel we have a piece of fare work underway. What we've seen in the past is fares are pretty inelastic up to a certain point, but I guess my underlying concern is at what point would people stop travelling? If you think of a trip from CBD to South Auckland at peak on trains currently $7, at what point does that become unaffordable? Is it $10? Is it $15? It's that type of thing when suddenly either people stop travelling or they revert to cars, and what's the tipping point?
And thank you, Chair. The extra work that you'll have to be doing to go to different pots on one project, such as Lake Road, Glenvar, things like that, would that also be the same for, say, rehabs? There's been rehabs happen in the North Shore Ward at the moment. Would you be having to go to a different fund to fund the upgrade of the road and the footpath at the same time, or would it still be one project? Would that, I know for new projects it sounds like several buckets, but would that be renewals as well? Because that seems, the biggest request I get is fixing footpaths, and we can never have enough money already.
Details to work through practically, but what in reality happens is we award a piece of work to a contractor, and then we have to do the scurry around behind the scenes and try and secure funding out of different pots. It just adds a lot more complexity into the system at a time that there's desire there to simplify business casing processes. and it's an important point. The GPS sets aside money. There's still a whole process to get through to actually access the money and approval processes, and it does make it more complex.
Last question, Chair, sorry. So the essentially almost no mention of climate change carbon emissions at all, considering the TERP and Te Tarakia Tāwhiri are aligned to the Paris Agreement signed up by the government in 2016-17, where does that leave us as a city on carbon emissions, if you've modelled that? And I guess, could we just check if we've done the modelling of what Paul Winton said, that leaning into the ETS would mean sort of a $1 increase to a litre of petrol if we only lean into the ETS without any other intervention?
No, we haven't had the opportunity to do that modelling, and part of that, of course, is that there's very little detail on what the government means when it says it's going to rely primarily on the ETS. In terms of Auckland's ability to meet its strategic priorities in this regard, then obviously if funding is constrained in certain activity classes, then that makes it that much harder for us to do. Of course, there are still plenty of things we can do, but it won't help.
Member Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, pretty quickly. I just want to read this first before I ask the first one, just around Māori outcomes. We recommend that GPS specifically reference the need for engagement with Māori across the transport sector, in line with legislative obligations to Te Reti of Waitangi under the Local Government Act. And then after that, we recommend that the GPS include a focus on enhancing Māori outcomes and improving transport equity. So basically, we're really simply asking the government to please do their job when it comes to Māori. We're not raising the bar here, we're not really challenging the status quo. If we're going to start with an empty cup, please just live up to your legislative obligations and hope we can elevate this position, when we should be starting with giving effect to the treaty and go from there. Start with a sort of full cup and work towards alignment. Any reference to Māori outcomes or engagement should have at its heart the requirement to give effect to the principles of the treaty, which is like a catch-all for the way government should engage, consult and promote their relationship with Māori. And as mentioned, Māori can elevate these kaupapa. We're not one-dimensional and we're not simply here to be engaged. As mentioned today also, and put so eloquently, paraphrasing, engaging in a meaningful way with Māori
always have, and it's really not, there's no easy fix. It's not too easy to say. So enjoyment. Okay, so I've just been informed that the same technology problem we've had and unfortunate adjournment might not be able to help it in this circumstance.
They can hear now.
They can hear now. Okay, all right, so it's really back on. Okay, Councillor Williamson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to just stick with public transport services. I have huge problems with this submission across the entire thing and background data and so on, but I'm going to just try and narrow it down to this one screen that's up there. And in the attachment B, sections 136 to 138, and then I want to talk about 139 to 141, which is to do with rail. The first question I want to ask you is, are you aware that the contribution that public transport users contribute towards the cost has dramatically collapsed since 2016? Because in the GPS figure 3 that's published, the passenger was contributing around about 40% of the cost of running the public transport operation. It's now down to under 10. So the first question is, are you aware there's been a massive drop in the amount that the actual passenger pays towards the cost?
Absolutely, and obviously what's happened in between times is you had COVID, which made farebox drop down below 10% for a period of time. And then as we've come out the other side of it, the half-price fares have basically suppressed half of the farebox. The under 25 discounts that are about to roll off are also suppressing it by about another 5%. But on our clean farebox, when that drops off in about a month's time, will actually go back to just over 30% when you exclude commercial services. So the numbers in the GPS, and that's what we've just described as aligning to how Whakakotahi calculated, they're actually a bit out of date. They're working off older data that was still had that hangover of the half-price fares, from what I can see. Having said that, we know that farebox, ideally, globally, you'd want it back up around 40%, and that's what I was referencing before, is if you said ours at the moment is in that bit over 30%, we're going to be just over 30% because of the distortion of these discounts. There is scope to look at increasing it, and we are absolutely doing a piece of work on that as we speak. The other thing, though, to just flag, the reason why it's now more around the 30%, as well as if you think back to customer behavioural change post-COVID, you're effectively running a service that used to have 5 days of patronage during the week, that Monday and Fridays now has significantly less, so your economics have changed. So to get back to a 40% type fare box, you've actually got to be doing a whole pile of different things differently as well, in terms of customer usage patterns, but on average actually charging more than you previously did because you don't have people travelling 5 days a week.
Okay, well, sorry. You see, I find some real problematic parts of that answer. You talked about COVID being the big sort of driver there, except in 2016 up until 2020, COVID only struck in 2020. It struck at the end of 2019, but we didn't even have it here until 2020. It would drop from 41% was what the consumer was paying, down to well under 20%, so it more than halved before COVID came along.
If I could just address that. The material that's included in the GPS contains both operating and capital costs. So it's reflecting the cost we pay for PT services, plus what we invest in infrastructure to improve the PT network. Now, of course, you know, there's a lag. You start spending money to build a project, and you don't see the response in terms of patronage or fare recovery for some time after that. So it's difficult to tell from those numbers, you know, how much of that increase is due to the lag in infrastructure investment, and what we're expecting to see, particularly in terms of at least the operating costs going forward, is that we do get a recovery in patronage as the likes of City Rail Link, Eastern Busway and such come on board, and the fare recovery ratio for services certainly increases. So they're including infrastructure costs in there. So yes, as you invest more in infrastructure from 2016 you will see that number decline, but it will take time to get the benefits in terms of patronage, bringing the passenger contribution back up.
Okay, so let's now go to that paragraph 138, and where you talk about the 22 up to 136% required to have massive fare increases. I don't know how you can do that. Let me explain. If I look at the upper and lower of the public transport services in the GPS, the lower is 400 and then going up 20 million a year, 420, 440, 460. The upper is 750 and going up 20 million a year, 750, 770, 70, 90. The current amount, I understand, for that activity class is 500 million. We don't have it in here, but I've checked and that's what it looks to be, is the current amount. So how can a lower of 400 but an upper of 750 result in massive increases in fare increase, regardless of which one of those we choose? I would have loved some more background about what is currently being spent, because that's not here.
I haven't got the actual in-year numbers in front of me, but if we come back to the simple maths, so based on the draft LTP, we require in circa round numbers 300 million of co-funding from Waka Kotahi next financial year. The bottom end of the activity class range is 400 mil, and that's nationally. If we got 40% of the 400 mil, we have about a $142 million shortfall in government funding. And sorry, the bit we didn't explain is that on a matched basis, if that GPS money falls away, we've assumed that council's contribution would also fall away because it's on a 50-50 cost share basis. So you actually end up losing a substantial portion of your cost, your funding for public transport, and that when you mathematically solve it, gives you about 130% required increase in fares to plug the gap. And what that does flag is it would, if government don't fund their fair share, there's an interesting choice then for council about whether it wants to tip in more as is set aside in the LTP or scale it back.
Okay, well, I just, when you present something like this, I would suggest that what makes it really valuable is we see what the actuals are right now and a comparator. Because if, as it says in the GPS, that there's going to be a 400 to 750, and currently it's 500, then there's a potential for there to be more money in this activity class.
Sorry, I'll just point one other thing out too, is this issue is not unique. The same issue occurred last year, and what isn't well known is that the government in the May budget last year. So I know in May budget last year, previous government had to tip $80 million in to keep PT running, and they did it as a one-off top-up. So the problem was already there.
Okay, and with regards to rail, my second part was to be about rail. Is it true that we still owe quite a sum of money to Kiwi Rail for track management or track maintenance?
So at the moment, we pay Kiwi Rail a track access charge. We've paid an amount for a number of years, and that number, as set aside in the draft LTP coming forward, is in the sort of 40-50 million type range per annum. Kiwi Rail have recently come and asked us for over 100 million for maintenance, catch-up maintenance and ongoing maintenance as they fix the tracks. That number is not budgeted anywhere in either the LTP or in the GPS.
So can I just get some clarity about this? First of all, I'm asking about the past. Is there a number of years going back for which we haven't paid the bill?
No, we've always paid a track access charge, and
there's no money owing from the past.
Okay, so no, there's not, but there's always been a negotiation around how much we pay. It was typically less than what Kiwi Rail asked for, but we weren't always sure it was actually getting spent on maintenance. And so that track maintenance charge rolling forward, there's a big delta between what we have budgeted and what Kiwi Rail are now asking for more recently. So you could frame it a different way. There is a significant issue around the ongoing cost of maintaining the tracks, let alone the retrospective catch-up that's occurring at the moment. And the broader question is who should be paying it. The implication is if the tracks don't get properly maintained and funded going forward from a renewal basis, that it might need, key rails within their right to actually ask for tracks to be slowed or train services to be slowed down or reduced.
How does that dilemma get resolved? If they believe we should be paying X and we think it should only be half X?
Is there a disputes resolution clause? I don't know the specifics of how the commercial piece, I'm not that close to it, but what we have done is there are specific paragraphs flagged in here. I think it's paragraph 140 calls out the exact issue.
Yeah, I've read that. Okay, I just think this is a ridiculous process of this much detail in this sort of short time and when we get the material this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so that wraps up the questions. The Mayor just wanted to ask a final one, but he's disappeared. Duncan, has the issue that Councillor Henderson been brought up dealt with? We're just trying to see if people can still hear us online. Have you got a question to ask, Councillor Bartley? Yeah, okay, so we'll go to Councillor Bartley and then finish off with the Mayor, if that's okay. We've had a good crack at questions here today. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this report and for your work on this. Since this GPS seems to be the focus is on the economy, and Auckland is the powerhouse for the country, have we got enough there to make an argument of the economic effect? Should the government not go ahead and fund Auckland adequately through this GPS?
Certainly in terms of specifics, no, in the sense that we haven't, there's not enough detail on the GPS to be able to undertake any kind of modelling or anything like that of the economic impact. But it probably gets back to the point I was trying to make at the start, which is around if the goal is enhancing productivity and economic growth, then the types of things that you would do in Auckland differ than the types of things that you might do in terms of your transport network to less urbanised parts of the country. And it boils down to the need to get more out of what we've already got in Auckland. And that has implications for the types of activities that we would look to fund. And those types of activities are, as a general rule, de-emphasised in this GPS. Michael's got something to add.
I might add to that briefly. Just as an example to make Rob's point, if you look at the roads of national significance that are proposed, including Warkworth to Wellsford, you're looking at an additional about 70 kilometres of road length for Auckland. Now, Auckland already has over 8,000 kilometres of road. So the whole RONS program is an additional 1% on our road length. And yet, in the time it'll take to deliver that, Auckland's population is likely to grow by about 20%. So if that's our primary impact on the transport system, then our economy will be going worse and congestion will be getting worse. The answer for Auckland is really about making our existing system more efficient because we cannot build it quick enough. And that's where the importance of projects like time of use charging and of mode shift, as has been discussed, is critical. Cars are fantastic. They will shoulder the burden of transport for Auckland for a long time still, but they take up a lot of space. We need to move more people onto public transport and onto walking and cycling if we're going to improve our economy.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Bartley. Having said we're just down to the Mayor, we've received 2 late entries into the field, so we need to have a stop to try and address this sound problem before we go into the debate. So I hope this is the end of the question so we can do that. So we've got, you still want to go last, Mr. Mayor?
I was just going to do an add up, but it can wait for a while.
Okay, so if we could make these the last 2, Councillor Lee and Councillor Newman, please.
Mine is a comment relating to Councillor Williamson's input, so I'll defer it until later, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Newman.
Mine was relatively technical, but the response that I've just heard really spikes my interest now. So can I just ask, because I'm reading the Auckland Transport Board minute from March 2016, which was Auckland Transport Board's acceptance of the recommendations for the notices of requirement for one of the RONs, Readout Road, Mill Road Corridor Project, NOR subject to conditions, which Auckland Transport's Board accepted. And it provides commentary as to why it accepted it. Safety, economic efficiency, future-proofing for growth, which has massively occurred. I'm looking at the submission. The submission reflects a fairly agnostic approach to the RONs, and says it will defer to the ITP. I'm trying to work out if the ITP is going to include the RONs or not. But what I've just heard appears to signal that the Auckland Transport officers are very sceptical now about the RONs for which the NORs have been agreed. So can I just get an understanding if the Auckland Transport advice today is different from the advice that was accepted by the Auckland Transport Board at the time that the NOR for Mill Road was accepted for stage 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think the comment that was just made was more relating to. Well, you want to jump in, Dan?
Oh no, you keep going.
Was more relating to the Northern State Highway 1. So that's not an Auckland Transport project. And we have had a change in policy objectives, particularly from the council side, since that point. But I think what we're trying to say with this submission is that we do want to look at all these larger projects that are captured within the GPS as high priorities to identify, you know, excuse me, collectively which of these are the priorities for investment to go next, given that funding from both sides is reasonably constrained.
Do you want to add anything to that, Dean, or is that fine?
Look, I'll leave it at that, except to say that I wasn't aware of that minute. I've not gone back to 2016, in fairness, Councillor. Our expectation as both an executive and no doubt the board, speaking on their behalf, is that as these new RONs projects are defined, that they'll go through the same rigour with a BCR and a case for them. And that'll be represented, but there's a lot of competition in this current GPS for limited capital, and the government's made those a priority. We'll have a look at them on their merits when we get closer to it.
Mr. Chair, respectfully, my question was quite specific. If Auckland Transport stands by its recommendations through an evidential NOR process for the RONs, because it wasn't just about the northern RONs, it was a broader statement than that, and it goes to where, yes, I accept that there might have been some policy changes around here, but there has been a change of government. And so what I would like to know is, does the evidential process that led to the NOR that Auckland Transport accepted, does that stand, or are you walking that back?
I'm sure that at the point in time that was done, it stood, but we don't know what the current RON's definition is, so I couldn't comment on how it stands now, Councillor. And that's all I'm saying, is that it should be looked at on its merits when we get it. Hasn't been got yet, and no, I haven't had a chance to have a look at that, nor as a board, but accept that the government has priorities around the RONs program.
Okay, so thanks everyone. We're going to have a quick break, just a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes now, to try and deal with this issue with technology at the back. And when we come back, we're into the item itself and debate. Hopefully we've canvassed a lot of the items there. So just a quick adjournment, and we'll be back at 20 to 12. Thank you.
return to your seats. So we have some high technological intervention involving the use of fans, trying to cool down the equipment that's causing us the difficulties. Hopefully people online can hear us now. So we will move to the debate very shortly. But just before we do that, I just invite Barry Potter, Director, just to make a couple of comments, observations in respect of the process going forward that I think is very helpful and should inform our debate and our resolutions here. So over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Chair. And if I might just address a couple of things. The first one is to make sure we acknowledge the work that Robert Simpson and his team, Elise and Harry, have done, and the AT team with Hamish Bunn and Nikki and Mark. It's been an incredible workload that they've taken on. They've worked weekends, as Robert said, worked very late at night. I know the time frame is very compressed and the information only became available this morning, but they have been exceptional in the hours that they've put in, and it's important we acknowledge that. So thank you very much to the team and the way they've worked together. The second point is to just flag how the recommendations are structured here, and the way they're structured comes out of the workshop and out of engagement with council laws, which was to get the recommendations, the detailed recommendations for the response to the GPS as a total package and consider them as a total package. That's been the drive behind this. That's the way the recommendations are structured, and hence you'll see them on the wall there. That's the approach that the team have taken as I pulled this together. So thank you, Chair.
Okay. So thank you for that, Barry. So as we were told earlier, that the way the resolutions or the recommendations are packaged, it's in themes, and we really don't want to start picking individual bits apart, because we've structured this work that it goes in as a submission as a whole. There may well be parts people don't agree with, but really the vote and debate is on the balance, the overall tone of the submission, and whether you support it or not. So with that in end, we have the recommendation moved by the Mayor, seconded by Councillor Fletcher. So over to you, Mr. Mayor, to kick off the debate.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for everyone's input. And I agree with Robert and his team have done a good job, along with the AT people. This is a submission of Auckland Council and AT here. We didn't want two separate ones. We've agreed that we are reducing a number of people in the whole transport thing, which is crowded. So we're going to have one Auckland voice. I think the point of this, it's a submission to influence a new government who've put out their policy, which has significant changes from the past, and we're wanting to support the bits we like, change little bits here and there that we don't, and point out the impacts of some of that stuff, which is probably negative in some ways. I think the tone of this is excellent. There's no sense throwing a rock at the person who's got the money, but we're just pointing out bits and pieces that are there, that are not there. The most important one that wasn't there was the integrated transport plan, something which the government and the Prime Minister have agreed to, but we do want to put that in there. There are lots of things that most of us can support, and there's bound to be things that annoy some members, which I think we've really got it about right, because we're never going to get 100% agreement on every single part of this. With regards to, for instance, the safety thing, increase, we heard that, you know, removing some of the cost of the expensive stuff we put in might increase the number of people who are hurt. I think increasing policing will have a balancing effect. I know that, for instance, in some parts of Auckland, and there's very low levels of compliance with registration and warrants of fitness as well. So there's a balance to this. We're no longer a rich country where the government can just print off money to fill everything up. The fare box question raised by Councillor Williamson's fair, that it's been below what it should be, and they say we've got to put it up. But so well, people won't come. It's almost inevitable the cost of driving a car is going to go up at the same time anyhow. So it's a relative thing. There's the freight industry there that seem to have got off a bit light. They do damage our roads. There isn't quite enough there for me in terms of shifting freight to rail, but I'm sure I know that there are other members here who are quite unhappy about the lack of emphasis on climate and other things. We have there's been worry about footpaths, but remember, 50% of our air roads are rural roads, and they never have footpaths. And those people will be very pleased to see some improvement to the road services. So it's a mixture. And I think that on balance, we have raised, and carefully in here with Robert's leadership, we have raised and pointed out the things that we don't feel are thought through or are good for us, but we have pointed out those things which are improved. There are some things in here that are completely annoy me, but I'm quite happy to live with those because I know they're so supported by other people. And I'm calling on you all to think across the other way. I think it's a very balanced, well-prepared document in a short period of time, and I support the thing in whole, even if I don't support every bit of it in part. And I think that I'm calling upon you to behave in that manner rather than worry what about 87B or 23H. It's a good overall document. It is to influence the government's behaviour. I have had a discussion with the Minister saying that we are preparing a document which is balanced. It will point out the things that members are concerned about, and it will support bits and pieces that we think are quite fair. And we will remind him of the importance of the integrated transport plan, which he has accepted. But it is the government, and they are entitled to raise the cash and spend it as they wish. So, and one of the things I've always taught in business is to always get on with the person with the money. So I think it's just the right approach, and I encourage you all to see it as a document in toto rather than a collection of 138 sub-clauses, some of which may piss you off or not. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Fletcher, would you like to speak at this stage?
I'll reserve my right to later in the
Okay,
debate.
so Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Essentially, I was responding to comments from the questions and comments of Councillor Williamson. So they are essentially general. I take on board Mr Potter's comments about the lack of time for staff, but nonetheless, I think Councillor Williamson's complaint about the lateness of and the short time we've had to look at this document is reasonable, and we need to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Councillor Williamson made some interesting comments about fare box recovery and the ratio. In Auckland, the ratio of fare box recovery has always been much lower than, say, Wellington. Wellington always was able to meet 50%. The best I think AT got, and that was in 2016, was about 32 or 30 or 33% max, normally in the 20s. But I do recall in 2016 pointing out that AT was including non-subsidised and non-contracted services in its numbers, which made things look a little bit better than they were. The other point I want to make is that the access charges that Councillor Williamson raised with Kiwi Rail, and this is my comments are all about rail essentially, amount to some $600 million over time. They are expensive. They're not cheap. And yet, when it came to track repairs and then this rail rebuild project, this has been funded by special grants from the Minister of Transport, not from the $600 million or so that this council via AT pays Kiwi Rail. What Kiwi Rail did with that money is unknown, but obviously it got spread around the business. The point I'm making is we are paying expensive access charges for a rail network that is not fit for purpose and evidently hasn't been fit for purpose for some years. And that, I believe, means the council needs to be, and AT in particular, needs to ensure that the money we pay for access for a fit for purpose network is spent to ensure that the network is fit for purpose. And that brings me to our rail patronage and our situation, which has not recovered at all from COVID, and that is due to the rail network obviously not being fit for purpose and being periodically closed for significant periods of time. I would make the point that in regard to our PT performance, yes, we can argue with the government, and that's fair enough, and point out where the government is going wrong, which is also our right. However, we need to focus our critical gaze more closely at ourselves and AT. AT in terms of COVID, which was also raised here this morning, has still not recovered its PT levels to pre-COVID levels. And an argument has been made, which I think is reasonable, that there is behaviour change in terms of commuting. However, when it comes to our roads, they are being overloaded right now. Our PT is underperforming. AT is proud to say that we're 90% back to where we were in 2019. 90% is about 10 million passenger trips per year below what we were achieving before. And yet, and here's the problem, the cost of all this has gone up. So coming back to where I started on fare box recovery, one of the variables is the way we assess our fare box recovery, but another variable compared to, say, Wellington, or at least in the past, is that our costs are significantly more than Wellington's, in particular for rail, and yet our patronage now is even lower. So I think in criticising the government over its GPS, we also should be focusing on our own performance, which is, I believe, continues to be substandard when it comes to the provision of public transport. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Ferry.
Oh, kia ora, Chair. Apologies for the mask. I'm in a house with COVID and I don't have it yet, and I'm keen to keep it that way, although I am symptomatic, so we'll see. Hopefully you can still hear me okay. I just wanted to, I guess, find myself in the odd position of echoing the Mayor's thoughts on this, where just the immense amount of work that staff have put in, the balance that I feel that they've reached, particularly after our lengthy workshop chaired by Councillor Fletcher on this last week to try and find some consensus. I think this is a really I'm quite startled actually with the quality that staff have been able to produce in such a short time. And note that also we were given the opportunity, having been given the draft on Friday, to send in feedback over the weekend, which I took the chance to send a little bit in. So I think I find myself, as I say, agreeing with the Mayor. There are bits here that I don't like very much, and I will just briefly address a couple of those, which is particularly around the safety issues. I would have liked to have seen, as suggested by all aboard, some more specific wording around and the specific recommendations around school transport, safety around people getting to and from school, and noting the huge economic benefits as outlined for that. We all notice how much nicer it is on the transport networks on the school holidays. Imagine if we could have that on school days too, and we could if we had more government support for investment in that space. The other thing I just wanted to mention is the quite recent commitment by this organisation to the TERP and also to Te Tariki Tawhiri, much more recent than a 2016 commitment to a specific project, but something that we've done in the last term, and still remains a really high priority for us as an organisation, and good to see that being given due attention in the submission. So huge thanks to the staff. Thank you to Councillors Fletcher and Watson for leading us through this and getting us to a point where I think we've got a document that I would hope everyone can vote for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ferry. Councillor Turner.
Thank you. And I had written down here to say thank you to the staff to remind myself, because I can see how much work's been done. I'm beginning to get an understanding of the pressures in this place on staff. That said, I don't understand any of this stuff. I've only been here 18 months. There's pages and pages of stuff. Forget all the timing issues. I tried Googling stuff myself. We've got policies back there in 2012, Auckland Transport Alignment Project in 2018. We've got all the stuff we're talking about now. It all sounds the same, and I don't have the thick end of a decade worth of experience to pull out information that goes back 8 years. So, I have to sit here and do my job for the public. I take comments out of the discussion, which I link into. One of them, intelligent transport system. That's great. On Titirangi Road right now, there are some people who had their own 6 families, their own personal warning system set into the road. So on a blind corner, it's been there for like 40 years. 10 years ago, they resealed the road, ripped it out, and it didn't work, and Auckland Transport said sorry and put it back. This time they've ripped it out and said it was never there, you're lying. That was an intelligent transport system, we just even forgot about it. If the private sector had outcomes like that, they wouldn't get paid. And my gut feel, which I have to run by on this, is that it looks like the government's putting the financial thumbscrews on Auckland Transport and Council. And whether that's right or wrong, the word I would be told by the people to say here is, stop building speed humps. Because you try to fill up a room of people and give them this debate in the public, and the room will be empty in 15 minutes. Everyone's gone. When you walk outside, that's all they'll say. Stop building bloody speed humps. And they understand it right down to the bottom line of all this academia. And they sum it up in that term. We've got to listen to them. I'm being asked on their behalf to stand blindfolded in front of a minefield with no gaps between the mines and wondering whether my right or left leg will get blown off first. I will be voting no to this, because if in doubt, don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Turner. Councillor Henderson.
Hey, thanks, Chair. Look, I'm really stoked about our direction and just want to echo those words around thanking staff for their hard work. It's pretty tough when you layer the hours in, but also how politically charged this kind of stuff can be. So what staff did was they've merely followed what we've told them to do over several terms in our votes and in feedback from the public, etc. So I just want to thank you for that. I'd also recommend the local board submissions. I think some really fantastic analysis. I'd suggest they be appended to our submission directly if we don't already do that. Look, briefly, I am supporting it today, and I'd suggest that we put politics aside on our transport system, and regrettably I find the GPS puts politics over evidence-based approaches. I want to zero in on a couple of aspects of that. It's not the full document, but I hope that some of my colleagues will jump in and help out on that one. I want to talk about disability, right? I asked about that earlier, and too often we make decisions at all levels of government without thinking about its impact on disabled Aucklanders. I want to recommend a study talking about an evidence approach. Transport Experiences of Disabled People in Aotearoa, New Zealand, commissioned by Kotahi in 2022. It sets out the biggest challenges for our disabled residents, that being followed by problems with accessibility of footpaths and public transport. Quoting here from the report, a lack of available bus services was the most common challenge mentioned by respondents. Buses were either not provided, not close enough to walk to, or too inconvenient to catch. Disabled people fear they are being left behind in planning for sustainable city centres. I echo those words. They're being told in this GPS, economic factors override your basic needs to live in our city. People tend to extrapolate that group to talk about vulnerable users and include groups like children going to school and getting around the city. This GPS and the general transport policies around makes the trek to school more dangerous, more inconvenient and more expensive. Speed tables and slow speed zones get a lot of press around here, but I just want to remind everyone they don't get built for no reason. There isn't some snidey whiplash figure going around Auckland looking at ways to slow down cars. That doesn't happen. Speed tables are there because schools ask for them. They ask me for them, right? For those that want to make politics out of that, well, when the next primary school principal emails asking for help, I'll send it straight to them for an explanation, straight to them. In a city where our death and serious injury statistics are shameful and immoral, I'm a father myself. I just want my kids to walk to school safely. We in this country love the per capita tables, and we're talking about the Olympics and all that kind of stuff. That always comes up. Well, New Zealand's near the top when we're talking about per capita and the medals. Well, there was something last month that came out. We topped another per capita table. This one was no cause for celebration, though. This was the highest rate of car ownership on the planet per capita. What's more, we actually grew in rates of ownership by one of the fastest in the world, the fastest for a Western country. It's little wonder that our country has a productivity problem in this country. We've been talking about that for a long time, because we're all stuck in traffic. And to build mega highways to carve through communities will not help. The evidence of over 100 years of transport planning will prove that. This GPS barely mentions climate change at all. Imagine that, an existential threat, a situation that will result in the first generation to have a worse quality of life than their parents, barely mentioned. The fact is this GPS locks in huge carbon emissions, both in terms of sunk carbon of mega roads and an increasing commitment to vehicle transport and a hack and slash at any alternative modes of transport to get around the city. That, to me, is nothing more than climate vandalism. Finally, I want to talk about the public transport fares. It's something I talk a lot about around here. We're talking about an up to 136% rise. Is this action on cost of living? Our services cut to deny access to hundreds of thousands of Aucklanders. Is this action on the cost of living? If this gets passed as is, it will take money out of the pockets of Aucklanders in a crisis, or it will rip away their opportunity for transport choice, probably some combination of both. And of course, we know the people it will affect the most. It'll affect suburban Aucklanders the most. A lot of us represent those communities. It'll affect Māori and Pacific communities the most. It'll affect people living close to the line the most. I'm glad that through this sub, Aucklanders are trying to stitch together a transport system that benefits a modern world city. I want to thank staff again for that. A city that cuts your congestion and gets you around as cheaply and efficiently as possible. I want to borrow a phrase from the All Aboard group that presented earlier. The 3 Cs, cost, congestion and carbon. That's a very wise direction, and that's something that we should be thinking about around this table. Kia ora, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Councillor Hills.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. If this GPS stays in its current form, it represents a dramatic step backwards for Auckland and New Zealand. I'm hoping that the Minister and the Government will see what a disaster this is for our city. Evidence shows that our partnership with Māori doesn't exist. Our obligations under the treaty don't exist. The proposed GPS means more congestion, more deaths, more serious injuries, more kids hit by speeding vehicles, more carbon emissions, less access for people of all ages to walk around the communities easily and safely. Along with the $1.2 billion cut from the regional fuel tax, it means we will not be able to fund our current planned infrastructure, let alone the aspirations of Aucklanders. The GPS removes all and any focus we had on climate change. The TERP and Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, Auckland's climate plan, are based on well-supported scientific evidence to ensure we reduce our fair share of emissions. The targets are based on the Paris Agreement signed by the last national government. All Aucklanders should expect we aim for those targets that political leaders have already signed up to. Not only are the children and young people losing their newly found independence next month when free kids travel and half-price fares are removed, the government's potential $500 million cuts to public transport will have a crippling effect on the back pockets of all Aucklanders. Because you can bet the 90 people that were on the bus with me this morning, half of them will not be able to afford the $10 each way to get to the city. $4.45 is already too expensive, but that's way cheaper than fares from places like Franklin and Rodney. There are many communities who cannot afford to travel around our city now. Many are locked in our suburbs due to distance, income, or lack of access. Over 50% of those travelling across the harbour in the morning are in a bus. Can you imagine if half those bus users switched to their cars? The dramatic effect on emissions, congestion, and economic activity. If we cannot fund adequate services for the Eastern Busway and the City Rail Link, what was the point in investing in billions in those infrastructure projects in the first place? I also cannot comprehend why walking and cycling has become such a political football. People from all walks of life cycle and walk around our community. Most of them I see in my ward are kids, especially around school times, risking their lives to get to school. Imagine if we made it safer, how many more kids there'd be choosing those free modes of transport and freeing up the road for tradies, freight, and those who have no choice but to drive. Why does the GPS make kids the victim of the culture war that we're seeing right now? Future generations are begging us to make our streets safer, make the air cleaner, and play our part in climate change. Former Transport Minister Simon Bridges, who now chairs Waka Kotahi, put record funding into cycle infrastructure in Auckland. We have not seen that since. He said at the time that they were investing in cycling to give New Zealanders more opportunities to choose cycling, whether you commute to and from work, go to school, run errands, or get some exercise. He said when announcing the funding for cycling, we recognise the contribution cycling makes to healthier communities, and the safe and attractive cycling infrastructure can encourage people in urban areas to change their travel patterns. He said, that's why we're funding an integrated education program to help people understand the benefits of a bike-friendly country and the positive impacts on people riding bikes. Where is that leadership now? It should not be so controversial to let people have the choice to use safely the cheapest forms of transport around our communities. Kids should be able to walk and cycle to school safely. Aucklanders get up every day and make choices about how they travel around our city. Most still jump in their cars. Most days, they're stuck for hours in traffic. The more people who do that means the harder it gets for all of them to move around. But Aucklanders tell us time and again that if it's easy and if it's safe, they will walk and cycle for some of their trips, not all of them. And most say if it's affordable, easy and frequent, they'll get the bus, they'll get the train, or they'll get the ferry. Investing in public transport infrastructure and the services is doing the exact opposite of what Aucklanders want. It is the opposite of what every major city in the world is doing. We are losing talented New Zealanders to cities in Australia and all over the world where public transport is far better than it is here. I really hope the government will change this direction. I really hope the minister will change some of the things in the GPS. I understand some things will change and we will work with that. But right now, we need to build a modern, affordable, connected, safe transport system that all Aucklanders deserve. And I think the submission hits most of those points correctly. Kia ora.
Councillor Baker.
Oh, look, I'll stay away from making party political broadcasts, but I agree with the Mayor. We are here to support or otherwise the submission, and to not support it means that we accept it in its entirety, which I don't, and I accept that we don't make a submission, which is nuts. And so I accept and really want to do, again, acknowledge the work by the staff and those who have put this together. We need to also put a little bit of trust into the information and the knowledge that Auckland Transport have brought to this. It's a non-political thing for them. They are there to do as we direct. And so they are not here trying to create something for themselves. They are here to basically tell it as it is. And we need to put some trust into that. And, you know, they're not the great evil that some people like to make them out to be. So please accept this, vote for it. Let's get in front of the government, get our thoughts together and just move on with it. And you know, it's good to have it here, but let's just move on.
Okay, Councillor Foley.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if you can see me, but hopefully you can. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Like others, I'd like to start by just commending the staff. I think, you know, the time frame is not of our own making, and a lot of work has gone into the submission. And although we did only get it very recently, I did find it very easy to read and to follow, and I absolutely appreciate all of the hard work that's gone into the submission. Thank you also to Auckland Transport, to their officers and their board for working with our staff to get this across the line. I'd like to also commend the local boards. I've had a good chance to read through their feedback, and despite the short time frame as well, a lot of their feedback is very detailed and very specific, and so I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to talk what the Mayor has said and what Councillor Baker has just said, that the balance is right. Of course, we won't all agree with every little part of it. Some parts I think we could go stronger on, for example, around the environment and around the public transport funding and things like that. But generally speaking, the balance is right in terms of the submission. And others won't agree with other parts of it. But like the Mayor has said, the whole submission in its whole, we should accept. And I'm going to vote in support of it. Kia ora. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Foley. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. I'm not going to support the submission because there's a lot of it that I don't actually agree with. And just on the safety with the speed humps, and I take up what our Mayor has been talking about with the speed humps, they are actually sometimes not really a safety tool. If you remember, yesterday we had the fire service that gave a very good submission, and it was about mainly speed humps, and the speed humps are actually causing delays for them to get to save people, and they're also destroying the vehicles. So that's some of the reason why I won't be. And the other thing is, as far as around the schools, I think you'll find that a lot of the parents don't agree with all these speed humps. There might be some of the schools, this might just be, you know, the school that is very close to me, we've got about 12 speed humps, and it's one of the quietest streets you could ever imagine, and I've never seen or heard of anybody that's ever been run over. We have one of our schools, Farm Cove Intermediate, I just want to give them a bit of a plug if I can. They don't allow their children to jaywalk. They have to walk to where there's any crossings. They have to walk to the pedestrian crossing, and if the parents are seen jaywalking, they get pulled up. So I think there's a whole lot of things we can do. We don't have to spend a lot of money on speed humps. We can actually just educate people to drive a bit better and to walk their children to school in a good manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Councillor Bartley.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this. I feel like a local board where we've got the power to govern, but we have to rely on higher up, I suppose, to actually do what we need to do for our communities. I do want to acknowledge the staff as well and the timeframes, and appreciate the long hours that they've had to work on this to bring this to us to make a decision in public on this submission. And I appreciate their passion for this as well. I can see it very clearly. not only all of us sitting around the table trying to advocate for our communities, but it's coming from our officers, and I really do appreciate that. I support the submission. Of course, there's things in it that, you know, but hard to sit with, especially the economic focus, since we've just come out of a pandemic where we put the economy to one side and focused on people's lives. And it would be good if we did that here in regards to what's proposed around safety. I appreciate the local board's inputs as well, especially, you know, at short notice. I was in my local board meeting yesterday online and heard their resolution, so that again they're in support of the submission. I appreciate the submission, the officers putting in the bit that I sent through about not everybody has flexible working hours and has to use a car to get to work because there isn't any public transport options in their area. And so things are going to get harder for them once we start charging congestion tax, and yet there's no real investment in public transport infrastructure through this GPS that would have provided them with options, as well as the walking and cycling options, which see almost like it's set up to fail because they've got to provide demonstrated volumes of users. But how can you do that when you don't have the infrastructure in the first place? So I'm keeping it short. I don't have any strong point on the speed bumps. I just know that my niece and my nephew, they walk to school and, you know, slowing the traffic down is a benefit for their safety. I took a photo recently with someone from the retirement village in my area, an elderly person, because they were struggling to cross the road to catch a bus. So I see the benefits in both the elderly and the kids having infrastructure there to make it safer for them to get around. And then what people have said to us in the LTP submissions to make mokopuna decisions. And the majority of our city are actually under 15, over 300,000 of them. So that's how we should be making our decisions. And with them in mind, it is very hard to see how we can do that with what's proposed in this GPS, but this submission goes a long way to getting through, hopefully, some changes that will make it better. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartley. Councillor Williamson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I learnt a long time ago that in politics, if you go ahead and support things that have got lots of good bits and lots of bad bits, you'll get hung out to dry because you supported some wacky little element to something, even though you'd fought hard for all the good bits. So the balance isn't quite neutral on this stuff. I suggest that as a council, we should be doing one thing more than anything, is what are we trying to achieve with this submission? Because there are two paths you can go by in the old Led Zeppelin song. Do we want the government to listen and to make changes, or do we want to start preaching from the political pulpit, having speeches that make us feel good and excite ourselves about it, and have them listen to nothing? And I would suggest that if it's the first one, we want them to both listen and make changes to a GPS draft, then we would have been way better to have focused our intentions down onto the 3 or 4 key things that matter to this council, that would make a difference and that had a high probability that the government would listen and make change. But this is the most scattergun approach document I could see. This would have been perfect to have made a submission with the previous government was still in power and the GPS that they would have been following. I think this is tone deaf. I think this is totally tone deaf. And instead of saying we've got a new government that's taken a 180-degree turnaround, please also remember the numbers of what voters in Auckland. So I hear councillors around this time, well, I want to go with what the public think. The current government got way more percentage of the party vote they stood for in the Auckland zone than they did over the rest of New Zealand by a long way. I can give you the numbers, but it's about 56.7% compared to elsewhere in the 30s. And so what they were putting up as policy, which was a number of these things, was welcomed by the voters of Auckland. It has to have been because they voted for it. And I think we do ourselves a great disservice in supporting a piece of paper like this, which we get almost no time to do any work on, we get almost no time to develop some research and some response to, and is a scattergun approach where there are some really good bits and there are some really, really bad bits that make us look foolish to be supporting it. And so for that reason alone, it is not going to achieve the objective that I would like a document to do, and that is to get a government to listen, because they're wrong in some parts of this GPS that I'd like them to change. And we could have focused on those specifically and absolutely targeted, put a submission together and got a response that would have been all happy. We'd always say afterwards, wasn't it great we got the government to listen? If I was on the other side, and I have been a minister on the other side for many years on this, I would have looked at this submission and said that is just a scattergun approach, all things to all people, blowing in the wind. Let's put it to one side and let's try and find submissions that count. It's for that reason alone I will not be voting for this.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. Councillor Darby, you wanting to say something?
Thanks,
and then we'll go to Councillor Fletcher, and that should just about do it. Councillor Darby.
Thanks. I'll be supporting the recommendations before us in the submission. And I also want to acknowledge the concerted effort, the collaboration and alignment between the Auckland Transport staff and our Auckland Council Transport Strategy staff, the Auckland Transport Board, and now this governing body, this committee of the governing body, hopefully going to be signing up for this submission. I've been around transport planning for quite a long time, and I've seen numerous government policy statements or their equivalents and regional land transport plans being progressed. And I think since probably about 2005, I became involved, and each one has been, it's progressed Auckland, or in the case of the national planning document, a GPS or equivalent, it's progressed our nation in the transport space. I can't say that this draft GPS is going to progress the nation, let alone Auckland. It actually takes us back. And while I've heard some councillors say don't be political, I'm not being political here, I'm just being bluntly honest about what I see. That's all. That's all. And I would be saying this to whichever government was the parent of this document. Either one, either of the two major parties or any of their coalition partners. But this draft GPS appears to be written by someone who is very fondly holding on to the rear view mirror, looking at the past. The past is the past. We will not go back there. My plea to government is to dispense with the advisors that have brought you this advice. You can hire some of ours, and we've got some goodies. They're facing the future that Aucklanders are demanding. We know that our Aucklanders do not want to live in the 1960s. They might have been born there. I was born just a little bit before. I know the fondness I had for driving in the 1960s, well, not me, maybe late 60s, 70s, but it is not our future. The great cities of the world are not drive me crazy cities. They are not. They are facing the future in the 21st century where public transport, modern transport systems based around public transport, walking and cycling, that is the system that our Aucklanders want to see delivered. This one will not. It looks like it's been inspired, this draft GPS, and I'm not going to put the criticism smack on the government here, but there are people advising the government who somewhat look like Automobile Association old boys, 1960s vintage, that have been resuscitated, sent on a junket to Miami, and they come back and write a GPS for Auckland. That's sort of what it looks like to me. The draft GPS does not face the transport future Auckland demands, let alone what Aucklanders demand. And that's got to be a world-beating transport system. This is not a world-beating transport system that we're heading towards here. This is a retrograde system. It's absolutely in denial of the future. I won't even mention climate change. Other councillors have referred to that. It doesn't lead us at all. It takes us back. If you look at bus, rail, light rail, ferry,
infrastructure and services, it's miserable. It does not contribute at all. It takes away. It is mean on pedestrians walking in their neighbourhoods. It is equally miserable in making cycling to school safe. It should be. It has to be. And when it comes to safety, it is plain deadly. It is absolutely deadly. We will see more Aucklanders not make it home under this GPS as it's delivered in part for Auckland. More will die. And I treat safety on our transport network as my paramount responsibility as a councillor and also an Auckland Transport Director. We need to make sure that anybody who walks past their letterbox in the morning and is in the road network gets to walk past their letterbox in the evening and arrive home safely. This draft GPS, as it applies to Auckland, lessens that guarantee. This is a GPS that needs to be turned around, and I repeat my plea to the government to turn it around, turn it to face the future. That is my plea, and that is what our submission summarises as well, which I entirely support. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Newman.
Well, I'm angry. I'm just so angry at how this, what should have been an additive process, has, in my view, devolved into a political slugfest. That's how I interpret it. I've listened and I was going to go and support the submission without any condition this morning. And I thought, well, you know, then I heard a reflection about the roads of national significance. I thought, well, look, I don't feel that I could have confidence in relation to the key recommendations for the Integrated Transport Plan 1 and 2 and the appendices because of the way in which that was framed. And I say that as somebody who does read the evidence, actually, because I was part of that process in relation to the NOR for what is one of the roads of national significance. I've had to observe the framing of these matters on social media. A 5-lane corridor, that's 5 lanes one way, that is never going to happen. I have read the draft GPS in relation to the roads of national significance, 4-lane grade separated highways. Now, the truth of the matter is, Mr. Chair, I would have thought the recommendation should have been we will incorporate the RONs into the ITP, but there are caveats for that we need to address. It needs to address, for example, the fact that the consequential OPEX, the renewals and maintenance, needs to be picked up by government, that the substructure around drainage needs to be addressed. I have been through these. There have been people around here who have celebrated the walking back, the dumping of projects by the previous minister, who is now no longer in Parliament, and instead said that, well, we can't actually address some of those critical arterial corridors that accommodate growth, address safety, and have significant environmental features that would be to the benefit of the community for which that will be located. Improving resilience, addressing stormwater, and we can't say anything positive about that in our submission. We can't say anything about that. Instead, I have to listen to speeches from people who have no place involving themselves in debates for which they haven't been part of through the NOR process, actually. So I'm at a quandary, Mr. Chairman, because I accept that the Mayor wants to put in a submission that reflects the sum of all parts, some which are good, some which are not. I'm really at a quandary because I'd like to think that I try and just accommodate things even if I can't. And it leads me to the conclusion, Chair, that if this process, if this submission is about knocking over a GPS and trying to stick a thumb in the eye of the government, then I need to record my vote against that. And maybe the solution for me is to lodge my own submission separately, which is, you know, I've been encouraging people to do so. Maybe I'll abstain. I probably will vote against the whole thing because at its heart, this debate today has not been helpful. This debate today has been political. And my final comment, Mr. Chair, will be to Auckland Transport. I would suggest that the officials from Auckland Transport support their own evidence for which they have placed on the public record previously as part of a judicial planning process. And if they're not aware of that, well, it's available. It's informed the NORs around the RONs, or at least one of them. And I think that if the government is prepared to come along and pay for that, then good. And if the officials are not prepared to be part of that conversation because they no longer support their advice, then I think they need to reflect that back to the Auckland Transport Board. Because some of us do follow the evidence, and the evidence is clear, and Mr. Kimpton will need to be aware of that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. I was listening to Radio New Zealand this morning, and one of the speakers that Catherine Ryan had used a quote that I really, it gives me a lot of time to think, and that is that perfection is the enemy of the good. And that was Voltaire. And what he was getting at is, so often we strive so hard to be so jolly perfect that we end up doing nothing. And nothing is more apparent to me than the polarisation that I've seen in my years in politics over transport, which is something I feel really passionate about. So what I've watched over the years is, you know, and as somebody who was very keen on light rail, actually got involved in purchasing some property for it from the inner city through to Mount Roskill. We were so busy striving for perfection that we ended up doing nothing. Now, to me today, I'm really sick of the shroud waving I'm hearing. And it's from all sides, you know, it's a lot of shroud waving where we all hold the moral high ground. We all have such enlightened views of the world that if you just don't listen to whomever it might be, the world's all going to come to an end. Well, I don't think that's the case. This is a cycle that happens every 3 years. It's like a very long pregnancy, you know, a long gestation. And this is really the first step in it. We're also trying to navigate a first step with a government that has come in, that is still coming to grips with a whole lot of issues, but I think is well-intentioned. I sat and watched on Sunday morning, I think it was, Q&A, while we still have some public broadcasting. I watched Simeon Brown. Now, I was really impressed. He was pushed pretty hard by Jack Tame, quite properly, and I didn't like all Simeon's answers, but what struck me was he was calm, he was unflappable, and he was willing to listen. And I feel really good about that. I know that the Mayor is in regular dialogue with him, and I think we've got a submission together that isn't going to please everybody, but it is a submission that is the first step in the journey of building a relationship with the good and the bad and the ugly. We've got to, as the Mayor perhaps pointed out, we have to recognise, you know, we need to work with our funders. That's both the ratepayers and also the government and all the other parties. So I'm actually not trying to suggest that this submission is perfect, because perfection is very difficult to achieve. I think this submission is a really good opportunity for us to show the alignment that is there between Auckland Transport and the Council. It's good that we're submitting together. I think it's respectful towards government. I think it is balanced and it's consistent as we approach the issues it's not inflammatory in any particular way. It has been a huge body of work. And I really, as others have done, want to acknowledge all of those who've worked so hard on it. I also want to acknowledge, and I speak on behalf of the chair here too, our director, Barry Potter, because he's helped guide us, and he's absolutely helped us at times find that delicate pathway where we need to bring parties together. But I am particularly indebted to the amount of work that has been undertaken by both Auckland Transport and Auckland Council officers. And I want to say to you, this is no time for extremes. This is not a time for anything other than what is going to take Auckland forward. And the weighting that we have put, I think, is sufficiently strong on recognising that we want in Auckland Tamaki Makaurau, we want to be able to work more constructively with government on that integrated transport plan. And in working on that integrated transport plan, we will be able to come back through all of those issues that you've raised on whichever side of the argument you might happen to be. I'm going over time. But we need to have something that's going to work for everyone, whether it's children, and we all have children and grandchildren, I have lots, whether it's freight, you know, we all rely on things being delivered to us, whether it's cars or public transport or whatever. Somehow or another, we're going to have to come together with all of the difficulties and funding challenges that the government and the country are facing right now, and find a place for balance. And I think that this is a good first step. And I do want to applaud the officers who have worked with us constructively, and to thank the chair because there was a desire to have this debate in public, and I think it was proper that we did so, and I hope that the majority of you can support this submission today.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher, and I don't think the Mayor will be requiring his right of reply. Mr Mayor, no?
No, not really. I just sum it by saying it is a very reasonable submission, and failure to offer a submission will be a massive black mark in the work we've been doing to get recognised as a regional government, as a partner and with the government and doing things. So just consider what you're about to do here, and try and not be angry. I can't imagine being angry about this.
The reason I asked you your right to reply, because I was just going to make a quick commentary myself, so I won't take that as a right of reply, but I'll be about 1 minute, because I think that's all I'll require.
John?
Yeah?
It's Councillor Sayers online. Sorry, I did have my hand up and it was acknowledged, but I was wondering if you wanted to take me before you summated, that was all.
Yeah, okay then, Councillor Sayers, where are you going?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think if a councillor's not going to support this, then it sends a very poor message to a minister. Putting myself in the minister's shoes when he gets this, if it's not unanimous, it obviously will raise some question marks in their heads. Councillors have the right now during the debate to register any concerns they have, and they can be noted. I would have hoped that there would have been unanimous support for those reasons, and therefore just signalling that I will be voting in favour of this, because we have to give some sort of feedback, Chair, and this is our opportunity to do it. And also the perception that a minister might have as a result of a non-unanimous vote here may well influence perceptions and decision making and partnershiping opportunities in terms of us wanting to develop our own regional transport plan and strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. So I'll final little 1 minute effort from myself, and I've listened very carefully to both
well, I wouldn't say sides, but different contributions that have come around the table. Thank people for that. But I thought that what I would do, as I used to do at university, was always go to the executive summary that in some cases saved you doing a lot of reading, but I have read this document. But in this case, I think the summary summed it up perfectly, and it basically said, Auckland Council broadly supports many of the strategic priorities highlighted in the draft GPS. So for the people that had concerns about the majority or the broad content, that's not really borne out by that statement. There are concerns that, as the Council for Aucklanders, that we do need to bring up, and I think we have identified those. The reduction in funding to public transport services. I don't want to see significant increases in fares. They're too high as they are. Any city in the world that has a successful public transport system, an important component of that is reasonable price fares and offerings. So if anything, we have to do more of lower fares rather than more of higher fares, because that's going to be counterproductive. So we're quite right in bringing that up. Similarly, with the approaches to reducing, I guess, emissions, again, if you look at any number of cities in the world, that they are light years ahead of us with electrification of vehicles, of use of public transport, of active modes, etc., etc. That is what cities in the world are doing now, and the progressive ones, of which there are very many. So we have to be part of that, and we're already along that road. So we need to signal that on behalf of our constituents. And I guess finally, and it goes to the notion of the government here. Auckland Council looks forward to working closely with the government to address Auckland's transport challenges and advance our joint transport priorities, particularly through the ITP. So what we're also signalling here is we understand this GPS is for the nation as a whole, but Auckland has its own specific challenges as the biggest city. And we're looking forward to working with the government. It is a new government, it comes in with a clear mandate, but we have a duty to point out what our concerns are, and I think we've done that in a reasonably balanced way. But more importantly, going forward as a consequence of this process, we hope the government will pick up. It's a submission process. They're there to listen, and we'll hope that they will pick up some of these key points, and what's more, that it'll be a further springboard for future and ongoing discussions, as I'm sure the Minister will be keen to have, Minister Brown. I'm absolutely sure of that. So, it's been seconded. All those in favour? Aye. Okay, if we want to have a division, then let's go to division. Councillor Stewart called for a division.
Councillor Baker?
Aye.
Councillor Bartley? Yes. Member Brown?
Aye.
Member Brown?
Yes, please.
Councillor Darby?
For.
Councillor Ferry?
For.
Councillor Fletcher?
Yes.
Councillor Foley?
Yes.
Councillor Henderson?
Yes.
Councillor Hills?
Aye, thank you.
Councillor Lee?
Abstain.
Councillor Leone?
Yes.
Councillor Newman?
Mr. Chairman, I've emailed the officers. I'm going to vote yes, but I have written to the officers and to you to indicate that I wish my vote to be recorded against the ITP recommendations at Roman numerals 1 and 2 in attachment B for the 3 reasons that I have set out, and that I would wish that have my opposition to 1 and 2 in attachment B and the reasons for my opposition to be recorded.
Okay, so you're voting for it and you're wanting that to be recorded, Councillor Newman, is
Well,
that correct?
the reasons why I'm voting against Roman numerals
Yeah,
1
we
and
just
2.
need to record what you're voting, what you're not, you're voting against, okay? And he's got, that's been handed? Okay, continue with the call.
Member Renata? Yeah. Councillor Sayers?
For.
Councillor Stewart? Councillor Turner?
Against.
Councillor Walker?
Yes.
Councillor Williamson?
Against.
And Chair?
For.
And that's carried.
That's
16 to 3.
carried 16 votes to 3. Thank you for that item today, for everyone's participation in it. And
Mr Chairman, can I make a quick comment about the next meeting? There's a REV workshop that was scheduled to be here in an hour's time.
Yeah.
We've moved it back to level 26.
Okay,
So anyone that's attending REV should be at 26 and 1:45.
all right, thank you everyone for your attendance today. Go out and have a joy.
Thank you, Chair.